All right, y'all. So Trump just rolled out a 10-point key focus for education, and a lot of people are upset. Now, there's a couple things that caught my attention. I think it was like point 4 or 5. I'll play the video and you guys can watch this for yourself. He had mentioned bringing back school prayer, which obviously, as a believer in Jesus Christ, that caught my attention off the jump, because I'm very curious to know what exactly he meant by that and what that would actually look like in practice. The second thing he said, which caught my attention, and as somebody who has very little experience in politics, I essentially have no experience. Like, I'm literally just learning about it during this election cycle. The very last point he said was that he was going to get rid of the Department of Education. Now, like I said, as somebody who knows nothing about politics, hearing that he wants to get rid of the Department of Education sounds crazy. But after learning more about the original purpose of the Department of Education, it does make a lot more sense why he would say that. And I also want to show you this video from the Flagrant podcast with Vivek. I want to show you what he said about it, because he mentioned some things that I've never known before about our education system, about the Department of Education, which actually does help me better understand why Trump would say that he wants to get rid of it. All right. So first things first, let's start with what Trump just said about his plan for education. And then we'll talk about a little bit of the reasons why people are so outraged in the comments about this. All right, let's go.
Here are 10 key ideas that will power our movement for great schools. First, we will respect the right of parents to control the education of their children. Second, we will empower parents and local school board to hire and reward great principals and teachers, and also to fire the poor ones, the one whose performance is unsatisfactory. They will be fired. Like on The Apprentice, you're fired. Third, we will ensure our classrooms are focused not on political indoctrination, but on teaching the knowledge and skills needed to succeed: reading, writing, math, science, arithmetic, and other truly useful subjects. Fourth, we will teach students to love their country, not to hate their country like they're taught right now. Fifth, we will support bringing back prayer to our schools. Sixth, we will achieve schools that are safe, secure, and drug-free, with immediate expulsion for any student who harms a teacher or another student. Seventh, we will give all parents the right to choose another school for their children if they want. It's called school choice. Eighth, we will ensure students have access to project-based learning experiences inside the classroom to help train them for meaningful work outside the classroom. Ninth, we will strive to give all students access to internships and work experiences that can set them on a path to their first job. They're going to be very, very successful. I want them to be more successful than Trump. Let them go out and be more successful. I will be the happiest person in the world. But we want our children to have a great life and be successful. And 10th, we will ensure that all schools provide excellent jobs and career counseling so that high school and college students can get a head start on jobs and careers best suited to their God-given talents. This is how we will ensure a great education for every American child. And one other thing I'll be doing very early in the administration is closing up the Department of Education in Washington, D.C., and sending all education and education work and needs back to the states. We want them to run the education of our children because they'll do a much better job of it. You can't do worse. We spend more money per pupil by 3 times than any other nation, and yet we're absolutely at the bottom. We're one of the worst. So you can't do worse. We're going to end education coming out of Washington, D.C. We're going to close it up, all those buildings all over the place, and you have people that in many cases hate our children. We're going to send it all back to the states. Thank you very much.
Okay, so
here are 10...
Trump, chill out, bruh. You already got your time, Trump. Let me talk. All right, so listen. The prayer. He spoke about it very briefly. He said maybe a couple seconds that he wants to bring prayer back to schools. Obviously, I can't really speak on that because he didn't really elaborate as to what that looks like. And I'm very curious to know what that looks like. Now, a pushback would be, okay, Nick, you're against this, what you call indoctrination in the schools, right? Like you want these books to be removed and you want, teachers not to teach about all this confusing, gender stuff. And you're against all of that because that's indoctrination, right? But you're for prayer, which not everybody's a Christian. Not everybody believes in God. So how could you sit here and be okay with him saying that when you're against that very concept? And I get it. I understand it. But here's just the truth. One of those things is sowing seeds of confusion. The other is sowing seeds of life. So I don't have a problem with it. I'm just very curious to know what that looks like. All right. So I want to know more about that, but we'll put that on the shelf for a moment until we have some more information about what that actually looks like. Now, from the Department of Education standpoint, as I said, I'm probably one of the most ignorant people when it comes to politics. So I had to do some research to understand why he would say that, because upon first glance, when you just kind of go through these comments, a lot of these comments are very fearful that if Trump removes the Department of Education, that we're essentially going to create a bigger problem. And I watched a lot of different videos on YouTube, a lot of different news reporting, read some articles, and they all kind of had the same sentiment that if Trump removes the Department of Education, it's not going to solve anything. It's going to create more problems. And in fact, it's going to create more problems for those children and those families who are less fortunate. And that's why I was kind of confused as to why he would say that. But then I came across this video that I want to play. The video that I mentioned earlier in this, segment from Vivek explaining why he would abolish the Department of Education if he were president. All right, so let's play this video. Let's react to it, and then we'll continue our conversation.
The first 4 agencies I had said I would shut down.
I'm so sorry. I know that was really loud. My bad. It won't happen again. It won't happen again. It won't happen again.
Would be FBI, ATF, CDC, and U.S. Department of Education. We've got, if I may say so myself, I would like to think, relatively orderly plans for carrying this out.
Please explain Department of Education, because that's another one that I heard your take and it was really smart, but I think to people it's like, what the fuck are you talking about?
It's just so jarring.
Yes.
And I'm sure for you, because you've probably read so much about this, you've thought so much about this, you've been in the think tank meetings with your people where you're like, how can we execute this incredibly difficult task? It probably seems like an absolute no-brainer, right? And one of the tricky things about being a politician, which I'm sure you've learned, which is different than being a CEO, is when it comes to a CEO and I'm subscribing to you, I'm going, I want to work for this guy, I believe in this guy. I don't even need you to convince me. I trust that you know what we're going to do, and maybe I'll go, hey, I think this is a good way to do it, and then I could influence your opinion. But when it comes to being a politician, you're going to make this change, and you need to convince me that this change is in my best interest.
Right.
And when I just hear shut down the...
Because you're the boss, actually. That's what it is.
Exactly.
People lose that sense. And one of the beauties of this Iowa caucus process, I did more events than all the other candidates combined, which is, I realized actually through the process what this was actually about. If this process of like Iowa going first through this caucus system is about something, it's actually about instilling humility into the candidates.
Yeah.
That's really what it's about. Is you otherwise forget who the boss is. Right? And so like I got some 27-year-old kid comes to one of my events. He's like, give me your accountabilities. What are you going to do by 12 months? Like, how will I know you accomplished what I told you to accomplish? And it landed with me because that sounds like a question I was asking back when I was a CEO hiring people. But if you're a presidential candidate, you got to remember, this is a job interview.
Hell yeah.
So I was like, this kid gets it. I was saying with the Department of Education, and I want to come back to your point about the political, because there's something important I want to say about that. But you asked about Department of Education. So the Department of Education, let's go to why it was created in the first place. See, here's the thing with some of these agencies is they were created with often understandable intentions, but they should have been a task force rather than an agency. A task force folds up and moves on when it's completed its purpose. This was created in the post-desegregation era, immediately after desegregation and civil rights movement, to make sure that southern states were not siphoning money from predominantly black school districts to white school districts. And that was, in some measure, at least happening in certain areas. So that's why the Department of Education was created. I would never create a bureaucracy to solve this problem because you know where that road ends. But at least say what you will, that was the intention of having created it. What it then became iteratively was, okay, that's not happening anymore. But the bureaucracy still has to live on. And any institution that continues to exist after it has achieved success ends up becoming a rot of itself. It's what happened to the UN. It's what's happened to, I think, NATO. But we can talk about each of these. What happened to the Department of Education.
We'll get there.
And so what happens with the Department of Education is they then start to focus on, okay, but how do we ensure equality in other ways? It's not just the funds. How are we going to ensure equality in other ways? That's where a lot of the affirmative action and the racial quota systems and what became the modern DEI agenda and anti-racism. So there are certain things that you have to adopt as a school. We have an $80 billion budget. About 10% of public school budgets come from the Department of Education. It's 10% of most local schools. Their budget comes from a grant from the Department of Education. But the U.S. Department of Education says you don't get that money unless you teach or adopt X, Y, or Z. A lot of those include hiring quotas, race, gender, et cetera, increasingly with respect to gender and sexual identity as well. Actually, there's some schools in the Midwest that wanted to teach archery or hunting. They say actually you don't get that money if that is part of your curriculum. So they start to play a centralized God over what does or doesn't end up in the curriculum.
And here you have the managerial class.
It's the managerial class at its finest.
Because those people that work there are not elected, right?
They're not elected. Are you kidding me?
So this is a perfect example of what you're talking about.
Totally.
The managerial class comes in, they dictate policy, and that policy is not being dictated by the people who should be represented at all. They're electing officials that might go against what the Department of Education wants for these schools, and the Department of Education is still leveraging their power and resources on these schools.
And they'll look at those congressmen and say, yes, sir, and then just continue to do exactly what they were going to do, regardless of what those congresspeople told them to do. And so what I say is that $80 billion, instead, just give that back directly to the states and to the people. Put it in the pockets of parents, right? Who then get to decide where they send their kids to schools. And while we're doing school choice, we might as well go on steroids here. We're in New York City right now having this conversation. In New York City, the worst schools are the ones that spend the most money. It's actually true across the country too. So a bad public school in this city spends about $40,000 per student per year. Good ones in this city, charter schools and otherwise, will be closer to $15,000 per student per year. So imagine if you have that monof coming back from the Department of Education to some family in Queens or Brooklyn or Bronx or Manhattan for that matter, it doesn't matter. And they're able to now be empowered to choose where they send their kid to school. 90% of the time, if they're switching their kid from the bad school to the good one, they're sending them to a school that actually spends less money per student. So while we're at it, I'm just saying, let's do this. Let the parent let the kid take half the difference with them. So if it's $40,000 at a crappy public school and $15,000 here, let's just say even it's $20,000 for even numbers. The kid gets to take $10,000, put in the investment account. If you start in kindergarten and that's compounding, that kid graduates with a $250,000 graduation
college
gift.
done.
College and then some, or not college and start a business or become an electrician or go to one-year school. And there's a part of the Department of Education in recent years. Is there some good that the Department of Education arguably does? There's some that is in vocational training. Fine, move that to the Department of Labor, where it belongs anyway.
Quick question.
So that's how we would organize
Why do the
this.
bad schools spend more? How does that happen?
So it's actually the teachers' union's bureaucracy, a separate managerial class.
So in the managerial class.
It's like a separate. I mean, it's one horizontal managerial class.
This is a verifiable factor. This is like the
the teachers' unions. The verifiable fact is the thing. Schools with unionized teachers actually have demonstrably poorer results at a demonstrably higher cost.
But that's not a function of the union. That's a function of like what schools those.
Yeah, there's a lot. So you're saying demonstrable. I'm just going to give you the facts that are going on. But I believe there's a causal role here where swimming in that level of money breeds excess. So leave the teachers' unions are et cetera out of it.
Yeah.
But swimming in that amount of money without accountability, that money's not tied to the performance they deliver or anything else. It's just what's coming on from on high via the state. In this case, the state of New York. The schools that are actually running on less money are the ones actually delivering better results on a per student basis. Most private schools spend less money per student than the public schools. You take these ultra elite New York schools out of because they skew the averages based on how expensive they are, but that's a distortion because people have a lot of expendable income here and they're bilking billionaires who don't care about a $60,000 versus $40,000 tuition. But across the country, broadly
also
speaking,
there's scarcity with those schools.
So that's a little bit of an anomaly here in New York City, but across the board, 90% of the time, if you're switching your kid from a bad school to a better one, you're switching to a school that spends less money per student on a per student basis.
Now, I'm sure there's many reasons for that, but the one tricky thing is, I think that Americans are abundantly aware of these organizations, but not really clear what they do. So when we hear abolish, we go, well, don't we need that shit?
Yeah.
So with the Department of Education, let's say the Department of Education is abolished. How do we have some sort of agreed upon curriculum that will educate the students to a sufficient level where they can succeed at government regulated tests and then get into the universities of their choice?
So I think national standardized testing, and it doesn't have to be run by the government, across the board is
forget standardized testing, but like the actual curriculum. And that's twofold. How do we make sure that we're teaching our kids? Because you can look at this
the
in two
basic
ways.
minimums they need to know.
And also, like, this is going to sound fucked up, but like there is a version of American history that you could also say is bastardized. But I think there's an important version of American history, like teaching the value of the Constitution, teaching Americans like why they're part of this great experiment.
Yeah,
and instilling
civic
pride.
education.
That's really important.
You know, one of the most controversial parts of my campaign platform was, and I stand by it, is I think every high school senior who graduates from high school should have to pass the same civics test that every immigrant has to pass in order to become a voting citizen of the
my
country.
mom just became an.
Did she? She passed the test.
It's not that hard a test.
It shouldn't be.
Yeah.
I met a 10-year-old girl in Iowa who heard about the controversy. She brought one of the tests to me. It was 100 questions. She got 100 out of 100, 60% to pass. Of course, she's 10 years old. But the questions that you wouldn't be shocked that most Americans would fail because that's what happens today. If you ask most Americans, how many branches of government are there? What branch of government does the U.S. president lead? Probably some of the harder questions are, who are three people who wrote the Federalist Papers or whatever. We could sort of go down the list, but.
You lost me on that last one.
But 60%.
Go tell that.
You didn't see Hamilton?
60% is a passing score,
Yeah.
right? And what they do actually for the immigrant population is there's 100 questions, they pick 10. 6 out of 10 gets you through.
Yeah.
This girl, 10 years old, she took 100
And
question
she
tests. She got 100 out of 100.
Yeah.
But I don't think that that's too much to demand of ourselves as citizens. Some of this falls on the families. I think I think all education begins with the family, and I do think that there's no escaping the reality that some of that accountability still has to rest at the level of the individual family. And I think part of what happened is, you were given the example earlier of that sort of general loss of individual accountability. I think there's a lot to that story where, one of the things I said in the campaign as well, it made some people upset, but the nuclear family is still the greatest form of governance known to mankind. Even go back to the days of Aristotle. You have the individual man who's part of a family, the household. The household is ultimately the form of government, really. And then you have a broader form of government that takes the existence of the household into account. It's been part of the building block of every great country known to humanity in our history. And so I do think that the abandonment of the project of the family, and giving up on that and believing we have to fill in substitutes for it, actually gets it backwards, versus saying we have a system that puts that accountability and empowerment.
This is the same thing.
Empowerment and accountability go together at the level of the family.
Sorry, but it's the same thing we're speaking to. It's like,
I think to speak to that point, I think a lot of what we have grown up on as it relates to education, as it relates to schooling, it's kind of like a hands-off approach from a parental standpoint. You just send your kid to school and that's pretty much it. You don't really think too much about it. And it's almost been used as another solution for childcare, which it is what it is. People have to make a living. They got to pay bills. So it is what it is. But it's unfortunate that we don't have more parents involved in the education of their children. Because at the end of the day, these are your children. It's not the school system's children. These are your children. And I didn't really realize that until recently, when we began homeschooling and when we began kind of taking control back. But in most cases, it's not realistic for a family to homeschool, or it's not realistic for a family to pull their children out of public school and place them into a private school where they have a little bit more say as it relates to the education process. It's not realistic because from a financial standpoint, can't afford it. Doesn't make sense. If you're homeschooling, then that essentially means that you have a parent that can stay home and educate that child. And if you're not getting compensated for that, then that means that the other parent is the one that it falls on from a, monetary, from a providing standpoint, from all of that, which is in this current environment economically is tough. So it's not realistic. But I like what he said. He essentially said, giving the power back to the parents and equipping them with the tools to do so. And I think that's very important. So, if we can find a way, and I have no idea what this looks like, but if we can find a way to do just that, to reroute those funds and to put the power back in the hands of the parents to educate their children and basically, it's interesting to me how much time kids spend at school when you really sit down and think about it. Even just look back in your own situation. I look back on my situation. The majority of my childhood, I swear I was at school. And the people who I was influenced by the most were my teachers, but more specifically, it was my peers, the people in my class, my classmates, my friends. Like, those were the people who I was influenced by the most. So obviously my mind and my worldview was shaped based on the people that I was around, not necessarily shaped by my parents. So I think a lot of the problems that we see happening with this younger generation, and we see a younger generation who is veering further and further away from God. I think if as parents, we had the tools to reclaim our responsibility to educate our children, we would see a lot more positive in this world than negative, in my opinion. In my opinion. But like I said, I have no idea what that looks like. Because also Trump was talking about, oh, he's going to give $10,000 per student if they're going to be homeschooled and whatnot, which sounds great. But once again, for the average person on a 2-income household, that's not going to be enough money. So I'm just thinking like, bro, I don't know what it's going to look like. I like the idea of what they're talking about because also it's very interesting. And, assuming that this is factual, it's very interesting that the lowest performing schools are the ones that are the most funded. So it's almost as if the Department of Education is rewarding these schools for creating failing outcomes. And these schools are not incentivized to do better because regardless of their performance, they're going to be funded. So they have no incentive to improve the overall education of that school because regardless of if they're flunking or passing, they're funded. And in some cases, overfunded, according to what Vivek was saying, right? So I don't know. It's an interesting conversation. As I said, don't listen to me about any of this stuff. Go back and you do the research for yourself. But I think the concepts that are being proposed in terms of reclaiming education from a parental standpoint and us as parents being the primary educator in our child's life, I think that is extremely lost upon us in this society that we live in. And I think largely that's due to the economical impact that we're living through and the fact that everything is so expensive. And a lot of us are just trying to survive. We don't necessarily have the time to sit here and be a parent and also be a teacher to our kids from the standpoint of working them through a curriculum, because that takes time and energy and patience. And that is a job in itself also. So it's an interesting conversation. I'm curious to see what they actually do once Trump gets into office and what that actually looks like. But you let me know what you think in the comments. Like this video, leave a comment, join the conversation, subscribe if you want to support. I'm out.